Some crimes are terrifying because of the violence. But the cases you're about to hear are frightening for a different reason. In each of these stories, the killer didn't just try to hide what they had done, they inserted themselves directly into the aftermath. They stood beside grieving families, spoke to investigators, acted helpful, calm, even trustworthy, while secretly knowing far more than they should have. In one case, restaurants across an entire town unknowingly served food cooked with water contaminated by a decomposing body hidden inside a water tower. In another, a respected young shaman claimed to use supernatural visions to help police solve a murder, only for investigators to realize the visions were possible because he was the killer himself. And in the final story, a man confessed to murder after claiming he had been attacked by the ghost of the woman he killed. Today, I'm going to tell you 3 true crime cases where the most disturbing part wasn't just the murder itself, but the horrifying lengths the killers went to in order to cover their tracks. On the evening of the 5th of March, 1958, Qasim was sitting inside his home, quietly eating his dinner. The day had been like any other, filled with consultations and remedies. As darkness fell outside, he was just looking forward to a quiet night. But then a sudden, frantic pounding started at his front door. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the sound of desperation. Qasim wasn't expecting anyone, but this kind of thing wasn't entirely unusual. People in crisis didn't always make appointments. So he put down his food, got up from his table, and walked over to the door to see who needed him. When he opened it, he saw 4 men standing on his porch. Their faces were etched with worry. He recognized one of them vaguely, a man from town named Kaur. He'd seen him around, but they didn't know each other well. The other 3 men stood behind Kaur, looking just as anxious. Kaur stepped forward and introduced himself, his voice shaking a little. He explained that he needed Qasim's help. A terrible thing had happened. His wife had gone missing the night before. He said he had spent the entire day searching for her, calling out her name, checking with friends and family, but she was just gone. He was at his wit's end, and someone had suggested he come to the Bomo. He hoped, he pleaded, that maybe Qasim could use his spiritual gifts to help find her. Hearing this, Qasim felt a knot of apprehension in his stomach. He was confident in his abilities as a healer. He knew how to mix herbs, how to perform blessings, how to calm a troubled spirit. That was his world. But finding a missing person was something else entirely. He had never done anything like that before. He didn't want to give these desperate men false hope. So, Qasim was honest with them. He looked at Kaur and said he wasn't sure if he could help, that this was outside of his usual practice. But seeing the raw fear in the men's eyes, he knew he couldn't just turn them away. He told them he would try. With that, Qasim invited all 4 of them into his home. They shuffled into his small living room, which also served as his consultation space. As they took seats on the floor mats, Qasim went into a small back room where he kept his supplies. He returned a moment later carrying a large ceramic bowl filled with charcoal and a small box of matches. He placed the bowl in the center of the room and instructed everyone to sit in a circle around it. He explained what he was about to do. He told them he was going to perform a meditation ritual, one designed to clear his mind and open it up to the energies of the world around them. The goal, he said, was to try and connect with the energy of Kaur's missing wife. If he could find that connection, he might be able to sense where she was. The men nodded, their eyes fixed on him. The room fell silent, filled only with the heavy air of anticipation. Qasim took a match from the box, struck it against the side, and touched the flame to the charcoal. A small orange glow started in the center of the bowl and slowly began to spread, the coals beginning to smolder and release a thin tendril of smoke. Then, Qasim did something that made the other men watch in silent awe. He leaned his head directly over the smoldering bowl and began to take huge, deep breaths, inhaling the thick smoke. He held each breath for a long moment before slowly letting it out. He did this again and again, his eyes closed in deep concentration. The smoke filled his lungs, and he kept going until he felt lightheaded, until the room started to spin, and he felt like he was on the verge of passing out. And right at that moment, Just as he felt his consciousness beginning to slip away, an image flashed through his mind. It was incredibly brief, just a split second, but it was vivid. He saw a field, a vast expanse of light green that seemed to stretch on forever under a dark sky. It was just a field, nothing more, but the image was sharp and clear. As quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Kasim snapped his head back, gasping for fresh air, his lungs burning from the smoke. He looked at Kor and the other men, his eyes wide. He told them he had seen something. He knew where they needed to go. About 15 minutes later, the 5 men arrived at the edge of town. They stood before a huge, sprawling rice paddy bathed in the pale light of the moon. The young rice shoots gave the entire field a distinct, light green color. It was identical to the one Kasim had seen in his vision. Without a word, they fanned out and began to search. They moved slowly through the mud and water of the paddy, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign of a person, any clue at all. The air was still and quiet. After just a few minutes of searching, one of the men suddenly called out. He had found something. Kasim, Kor, and the others hurried over to where the man was pointing. In the middle of the paddy, there was a large pile of straw. It looked completely out of place, like someone had deliberately gathered it and heaped it up. It was big enough to be covering something significant. Hesitantly, one of the men reached down and began pulling away the damp straw. As he removed the top layers, a shape began to emerge from underneath. And then they all saw it. It was Kor's wife. She was lying at the base of the pile, her clothes torn, her body covered in blood. Her eyes were lifeless. She was dead. Within the hour, the police had arrived and secured the scene. The lead officer was a man named J.C. Sabui. He was a practical, experienced policeman who had seen a lot in his years on the force. He listened patiently as Kor and his friends recounted the night's events, including the part about the Bomo and his vision. Sabui was, to put it mildly, skeptical of anything involving magic or visions. To him, it was far more likely that Kasim had simply heard a rumor or stumbled upon the body by chance and then created the vision story to make himself look important. But for now, that wasn't his primary concern. He had a murder to solve. The initial report from the scene was grim. The victim had been severely beaten to death. But there was another key detail. Sabui learned from Kor that his wife had been an avid collector of jewelry and always wore several rings, a necklace, and bracelets. When her body was found, however, all of her jewelry was gone. This immediately suggested a motive: robbery. It was a plausible theory, but Sabui knew better than to jump to conclusions. In cases like this, the husband was always the first person you looked at. So, about 30 minutes later, Sabui was sitting across from Kor in a small, bare interview room at the police station. Kor was still in shock, but he answered Sabui's questions. He told the officer that the night before, his wife had decided to go for a late-night walk by herself. He said it was something she did occasionally to clear her head. She had left the house and simply never came back. When Sabui asked if he knew anyone who would want to hurt her, Kor said no, but he immediately brought up the missing jewelry again. He seemed very insistent that it must have been a robbery, that someone must have attacked her for her valuables. Sabui listened, but he felt a sense of unease. The story about a spontaneous late-night walk felt a little thin. And Kor's eagerness to push the robbery theory felt a bit like he was trying to direct suspicion away from himself. Still, the missing jewelry was a hard fact. It was strong physical evidence that supported the robbery motive. So, Sabui decided to pursue both angles. He would keep a close eye on the husband, but he would also dedicate resources to finding the missing jewelry and tracking down any known thieves in the area. For the next 4 days, the investigation went nowhere. Sabui and his team worked around the clock. They searched the area around the rice paddy again and again, looking for a murder weapon or any other clues. They questioned local informants, trying to see if anyone had heard about a new stash of stolen jewelry being sold on the black market. They re-interviewed Kor, pressing him for more details about his marriage and his wife's habits. But they came up with absolutely nothing. Every lead was a dead end. The case had gone completely cold. Sabui was getting frustrated. The pressure from his superiors and the community was mounting. He felt like he was missing something obvious, but he couldn't figure out what it was. As he sat at his desk on the fourth day, staring at the case file, his mind kept drifting back to the one bizarre element of the whole story: the Bomo, Qasim. Sabui didn't believe in visions, not for a second. But he couldn't ignore the fact that Qasim's so-called vision had led them directly to the body. It was the only break they'd had in the entire case. He felt a bit foolish even considering it, but he was desperate. He had nothing else to go on. He decided that, as a last resort, it couldn't hurt to talk to the shaman one more time. On the morning of March 9th, 4 days after the body was found, Officer Sabui found himself knocking on Qasim's front door once again. When Qasim answered, Sabui explained the situation. He told him the investigation had stalled, that they believed the missing jewelry was the key to finding the killer, but they had no idea where it was. He asked Qasim, since he had been so helpful before, if he would be willing to try his ritual again. Maybe, just maybe, he could see something else that could help them. Qasim seemed reluctant. He told Sabui, just as he had told Kaur, that he was a spiritual healer, not a crime solver. He wasn't comfortable being so deeply involved in a police investigation. But he also acknowledged that he was already involved. His vision had led them to the body, and he felt a certain responsibility to see it through. He told Sabui that he would try. He couldn't promise anything, but he would try. So, for the second time in less than a week, Sabui watched as Qasim prepared his ritual. This time, it was just the two of them in the small living room. Qasim lit the bowl of charcoal and once again began to deeply inhale the fumes, his eyes closing as he entered his trance. Sabui watched, feeling a mix of skepticism and a tiny sliver of hope. After a minute or two of breathing in the smoke, Qasim's body went still. Then his eyes snapped open. He looked up at Sabui and said he'd had another vision. But this time, he didn't describe what he saw. He simply stood up, walked out of his house, and started walking down the street. He told Sabui to follow him. And so began a very strange journey. Sabui followed right behind Qasim as the young shaman walked through the town with a determined pace. It wasn't a random walk. Qasim would walk up to a house, stop in front of it, and just stare at it for a few moments as if he were trying to sense something inside. Then, without a word, he would shake his head and move on to the next house. They did this for what felt like an eternity. They looped through neighborhood after neighborhood, with Qasim stopping and staring at house after house. Hours began to pass. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Sabui's initial hope began to curdle back into his usual skepticism. This was a waste of time. He started to feel like a fool for even coming here. The first vision might have been a lucky guess, but this was clearly just a performance. This was going absolutely nowhere. He was just about to tell Qasim that this was enough, that they were done, when suddenly Qasim stopped again. He stood in front of yet another small, simple house, just like all the others. He stared at it for a long, silent moment. But this time, he didn't shake his head and move on. He slowly turned to face Sabui, and a look of absolute certainty was on his face. He pointed a finger at the house and said, "This is where the jewelry is." Sabui froze. A jolt went through him, a feeling of deep, chilling confusion. Because of all the houses in the entire town that he thought Qasim might stop in front of, this one had never even entered his mind as a possibility. It wasn't the home of a known criminal. It wasn't even the home of a distant relative of the victim. The house that Qasim had led him to, the house he claimed held the key to solving the entire murder, was Qasim's own house. In that single instant, everything shifted. Sabui's frustration and skepticism vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp suspicion. This was not a vision. This was not magic. This was something else entirely. It couldn't be a coincidence. He looked at Qasim, whose face was still a mask of calm confidence, and realized he was looking at his prime suspect. Sabui immediately called for backup. Within minutes, other officers arrived and they secured the house. Sabui then informed Qasim that they were going to conduct a search of his property. They searched the small house from top to bottom. They looked in every drawer, under every floorboard, in every container. And then, in a small wooden box tucked away in a back room, they found it. A collection of rings, bracelets, and a necklace. It was all of Kaur's wife's missing jewelry. Qasim's plan, whatever it had been, had just collapsed around him. The man who had presented himself as the key to the investigation had just led the police directly to the stolen evidence, which he had hidden in his own home. He was arrested on the spot. Later, at the station, Qasim gave a full confession. The story he told was a chilling departure from the image of the wise, gentle healer he had cultivated. He admitted that on the night of the murder, Kaur's wife had indeed gone for a walk by herself. By a fatal stroke of bad luck, her path had taken her right past Qasim's house. He had seen her, and he had seen the valuable jewelry she was wearing. In that moment, greed had taken over. He attacked her, killing her in the process, and stole her jewelry. Afterwards, he had concocted an elaborate and devious plan to cover his tracks. He took her body to the remote rice paddy and hid it under the pile of straw. He knew that when her husband, Kaur, grew desperate enough, he would likely come to the local boma for help. And that's exactly what happened. Qasim's plan was to discover the body through a mystical vision. This would make him look like a hero, a powerful spiritualist who was helping the community. It would place him completely above suspicion. Who would ever suspect the man who found the body? For a few days, his plan worked perfectly. But his arrogance was his downfall. When the police investigation stalled and they came back to him for more help, he saw another opportunity to reinforce his powers and control the narrative. He thought he could stage another dramatic vision that would lead them to the jewelry. Perhaps he intended to frame a neighbor, or perhaps he believed he could create a story so convincing that the police would think the real killer had planted the evidence in his home to set him up. But leading them on a long, winding tour of the town only to point to his own front door was a fatal miscalculation. The police didn't see a framed psychic. They saw a killer who had made a catastrophic mistake. Qasim bin Osman was tried and convicted of murder. His confession, combined with the discovery of the stolen jewelry in his house, left no room for doubt. He was sentenced to death. The aftermath sent a shockwave through the small town. The man they had trusted with their spiritual well-being, the person they looked to for guidance and healing, was a cold-blooded murderer. It was a betrayal that shook the community to its core, a dark reminder that evil can often wear the most convincing of masks. And in all three cases, the murderers thought they had come up with a perfect cover story. One person hid the body in a place where an entire town inadvertently consumed the evidence. Another pretends to help solve the very murder he committed. And a man became so terrified by what he had done that he eventually confessed to a dead woman whom he claimed had come back for revenge. Thank you for watching. If you liked today's episode, let me know which case made you feel the most uncomfortable. And if you want to hear more true crime stories where reality is stranger than fiction, there's a complete playlist waiting for you right now. See you in the next story. On Sunday afternoon, the 12th of March, 2006, 39-year-old Michael Zamidi Jr., known as Mike, was riding his ATV. In Freedom, New Hampshire, he glided across a huge frozen lake. Mike smiled as the cold air nipped at his cheeks and felt sharp in his lungs with every breath. Totally enjoyed it here. Mike resided in Wakefield, Massachusetts, 2 hours away for most of the year. Freedom was his escape. His parents owned a summer home on this lake, and he had come here his whole life. He felt at home in this tiny, tranquil lakeside hamlet where his real-life stress could melt away. Mike recently took a big stride. His parents lived just down the street from his Freedom vacation home, which he acquired. This purchase was huge for him. It signified his triumph. Mike owned a Wakefield cement contracting business. He spent years creating all-state concrete pumping, countless long days, and restless nights. He wanted to provide his wife, Michelle, and 3 children a good life, This second mansion, this lakeside refuge, proved he had succeeded. He succeeded. Success was costly. His marriage was also deeply strained by his concrete industry work. As boss, he had all the responsibility and brutal hours. He traveled often. This left Michelle and the kids mostly alone. She handled most of the children, housework, and juggling while he worked. She had lately informed Mike that his frequent absence, no matter how much money it brought in, was hurting her and their family. These ideas ran through Mike's head as his ATV skimmed the ice. Success, stress, marriage. He was attempting to comprehend it. He saw it then. He saw another ATV approaching from across the lake. His gut nodded as it approached. He recognized the driver. Sean Fitzpatrick was his other marital issue. Sean was their lakeside neighbor. He was the Zammitti family's close buddy for years. He resided in Freedom year-round after retiring. Sean was always around when Mike and his family visited. He came over for dinner and barbecue. On his boat, he took the kids. Mike's kids called him Uncle Sean because he was so present. Last summer, Mike found something that ended their friendship. He discovered his wife Michelle was cheating with Sean. Mike was devastated by the finding. Everything felt like it had shifted in his universe. Despite the treachery, Steve and Michelle decided to stay married. Still in love, they had 3 kids to consider. They started therapy together to repair things. Mike and Sean had no relationship. Mike hadn't spoken to Sean since learning. Mike disliked conflict. He found it easy to avoid Sean and rebuild his life with Michelle. Mike didn't want Sean coming right for him. He instinctively throttled his ATV, turned it around, and sped off. It was too late. Sean waved him down as he slowed. Mike felt shackled. He reluctantly stopped his ATV and waited for Sean. Sean skipped small conversation. He looked at Mike and stated he was delighted he met him. He wanted to apologize to Mike for last summer with Michelle. He acknowledged it wasn't okay and hoped they could go on. Sean's sincerity surprised Mike. Mike said, "You know what? It's all good," without meaning it because he despised awkward situations. Not everything was good. However, expressing that ended this awkward conversation the fastest. Mike really wanted to leave Sean and return home. He instructed Sean to hurry because Michelle needed him to pack the car. Before Sean could respond, Mike turned his ATV around and drove it back across the ice, leaving him alone on the frozen lake. Mike entered his holiday home 15 minutes later. He observed a row of nicely packed and zipped luggage beside the door first. He smiled within. Michelle had finished everything. Soon after, she entered and kissed him. He was assured the youngsters were finishing up cleaning their rooms and would leave soon. Suddenly, a car horn beeped twice outside. Michelle rolled her eyes and laughed. They both knew who it was. Must be Mike's parents. His parents spent the weekend in Freedom at their house down the street. The 2-hour trip back to Wakefield was also planned. Michelle laughed because the family joke was that Mike and his father couldn't go a day without chatting. Michael Sr., Mike's father, shared more than his name. Both father and son were best friends and business partners. Mike Jr. ran Allstate Concrete, owned by Michael Sr. A true family company. Mike had never considered alternatives. He jumped right into the concrete industry after high school and worked with his dad ever since. Like any business, the company struggled over time. Previously, a former employee filed a difficult case. Overall, Allstate Concrete was a success. Today, business was flourishing. Their time and resources were being consumed by a large Boston construction project. Outside, Mike visited his folks and talked shop with his dad. He asked Michael Sr. if he had called Chester Roberts, their employee. Mike asked Chester to join him in the office the next morning with his dad. Chester was their part-time driver and handyman. He was their most reliable worker in his early 50s. Chester was the first person they called during busy weeks. Mike was relieved when his dad claimed he'd spoken to Chester. They were ready for tomorrow. They parted ways after a few more minutes of talking. Mike Jr. assured his dad he'd see him in the morning, then walked inside to pack his family. The next morning, Monday, March 13, Mike Jr. drove his vehicle into Wakefield's Allstate Concrete parking lot before 8. He arrived on time. Being the first, he saw a light rain falling. He jumped out, ran across the wet pavement, and unlocked a side door next to a huge garage bay door. The Allstate building had a huge garage. Their cement trucks could pull through its 3 massive roll-up doors. Mike and his father handled all the paperwork and administrative responsibilities in a small office on the second floor. Mike took the metal stairway to the office after entering the vast, quiet garage. He relaxed into his desk chair and considered the week's itinerary, logistics, and mental to-do list. He heard another car enter the parking lot minutes after. Mike assumed it was his father. Chester was another employee who walked to work. He lived close. Mike then heard the basement door open and footsteps go up the stairs. Another truck entered the Allstate Concrete parking lot minutes later. Senior Michael. After parking his truck next to his son's, he ran for the side door to escape the rain. He pushed the door, but it didn't open. It stuck. It opened a few inches. Confused, he looked through the crack to see what was preventing it. His blood chilled. He froze. A man lay face down on the concrete floor in a dark, spreading pool of blood. The garage was dark, so Michael Sr. couldn't see the man's face. He had no idea who it was, but he knew it was not his son with painful certainty. Mike Jr. was a huge, broad-shouldered man, yet even in weak light showed a lesser physique. Michael Sr. felt his heart pounding his ribs. He could only retreat from the door, get his phone, and contact 911. Panic ensued after he hung up with the dispatcher, who promised help. He couldn't wait in the rain. A man was dead or dying in his business. His son was supposed to be there. It was his son's truck in the parking lot. He must enter. Mike had to be found and checked on. Michael Sr. staggered past the blocked side entrance and went to a wide roll-up garage door. He opened it, creating a dark, spacious entrance to the structure. He saw no one in the big garage. Running inside, he screamed his son's name repeatedly. No one answered. Mike! Mike! Just the sound of his furious speech in the vast, empty space. His son was absent from the ground floor. Michael Sr. sprinted for the stairs and took them 2 at a time to the second-floor office, his heart racing. He froze when he entered the office. The world stopped turning. Mike Jr., his son, was bloodied and collapsed in the office desk chair. After an hour, Massachusetts State Trooper Kevin Baker pulled up to Allstate Concrete in his cruiser. He saw police swarming the enormous industrial facility. Yellow caution tape surrounded the property. At least a dozen Wakefield Police Department crime scene techs and officers collected evidence by entering and exiting an open garage door. Trooper Baker was with the state police, not Wakefield. Massachusetts state troopers led homicide investigations with local police as usual. Baker believed this case needed all the aid it could get. Violence like this wasn't common in Wakefield. It was a lovely, safe hamlet 10 miles north of Boston. In this little village, everyone knew each other. Double homicides were rare here. Baker got out of his car and searched for the leader. His wait was short. Detective Richard Cass of Wakefield Police rushed over and introduced himself. Cass told Baker to follow him to the open garage bay and gave him a quick update. 2 dead men were inside. Both were shot. The company's owner, Michael Zamiti Sr., found them around 8 this morning. Baker followed Cass into the huge garage. They approached the first victim, face down on the concrete floor inside the smaller side door. Cass identified the victim as 5'1" Chester Roberts. Allstate hired him as a part-time truck driver and handyman. It was easy to spot him. Chester was a famous local who did odd jobs around town. He was known to Detective Cass. Baker saw Chester was shot in the back as he kneeled by the body. It appeared to be a shotgun burst. Pellets showed the spray pattern. No other injuries, struggle, or defensive wounds on his hands or arms were apparent. Baker rose and surveyed the garage. He saw no robbery signs. Unused, pricey equipment was outside. Nothing fell or was displaced. Chester's killer seems to have sneaked up behind him and shot him without his knowledge. Baker checked the doors and windows for a while. There were no traces of forced entry again. It didn't matter much. Chester probably opened the building for the day, and the killer followed. After surveying the first floor, Baker told Cass he was ready to visit the second victim upstairs. Baker followed Cass into the second-floor office where 39-year-old Mike Zimity Jr.'s body was found. Detective Cass whispered that he knew Mike, like Chester. This office scene was awful. Mike wasn't shot once in the torso, like Chester. Shot in the chest and face. Shotgun bursts were catastrophic. Blood covered his desk, chair, and paperwork. Mike was practically unrecognizable. Baker was struck by more than the gruesomeness. Body posture. Mike remained slouched at his desk. It looked like execution. The killer seems to have entered the office with one goal: to kill Mike Zimity. They touched nothing else. They entered and shot him in the face before he could stand up. This was deeply personal and deliberate. Baker developed a theory as he thought about this. Mike Jr. was presumably the first casualty. He was shot before Chester got at the building. Mike would have heard a shotgun explosion downstairs otherwise. He wouldn't have sat comfortably at his desk, surprised. Mike being shot first would strengthen the perception that he was the main target. Other than the awful brutality, the crime scene was tidy. The killer left no bloody tracks, smudges, or traces of searching beyond the victims. Baker quickly considered one idea. Italian-American construction family Zimitis. Fit a stereotype. He told Cass he wondered if this was a professional mob hit. While listening, Cass seemed attentive. He said Baker he knew the Zimitis well and that Mike Jr. and his father were decent people. He didn't think they'd be involved in mafia deals. But he admitted it was plausible, especially because Allstate Concrete was one of the Big Dig contractors. Baker's ears perked up immediately. The Big Dig was America's largest and most expensive construction endeavor. A Boston Harbor tunnel was a major project. However, the project was a civic nightmare. There were accusations of mafia involvement and corrupt payoffs from the outset, and it was years behind schedule and over budget. Baker now had to consider the possibility that the Zimitis had either become engaged in those shady transactions or crossed the wrong person at work. Baker believed the killer was a business associate, even if this had nothing to do with the mob. Someone who knew the company, building layout, and that Mike would be alone early in the morning was needed. Chester, the second casualty, was probably not intended. Baker wasn't clear why Chester was slain. Due to his late arrival and witness status, he could have been eliminated. He may have been involved in the Zimitis' fight. Baker stood still, scrutinizing the bloody paperwork on the desk. He then told Cass that they needed a thorough list of Allstate's previous and present workers and clientele. While strolling around the workplace, he saw a 1.6 gauge shotgun shell on the floor. He ordered a crime scene tech to bag it and examine the building for more ammunition. Baker and Cassie returned outside. Behind the police tape, a few observers and reporters had gathered. Baker requested Cass to talk with Michael Zimity Sr., the body finder, outside. DCAS shook his head. He said Michael Sr. was disoriented and barely able to communicate when he came due to grief and shock. Cass decided to send him home. When Michelle, Mike Jr.'s wife, arrived, another cop did the same. She hysterically claimed to have heard of an accident. When she learned her husband was dead, they took her home too. Baker accepted but wasn't pleased. Time matters in murder investigations. He preferred to speak to crucial witnesses and family members quickly while their recollections were fresh. He was sorry to miss the chance to talk to Michelle right away because the spouse is always a suspect in homicides. There was still a lot of work to do at the scene, but Wakefield police knew where to find the family. Baker advised Cass to canvass surrounding businesses for witnesses or security cameras. The next morning, March 14, Trooper Baker parked in front of the Zamidi family house in Wakefield. He and Detective Cass spoke with Michael Sr. After receiving Chester and Mike's initial autopsy reports, they didn't find anything new. Mike was shot twice, Chester once. Death struck both guys instantaneously. However, detectives had one hopeful lead. No CCTV cameras were detected on the Allstate concrete facility, but surrounding businesses had them. A team of officers was meticulously scrutinizing the clip. Another Baker team interviewed Chester Roberts' family. He could have been wrong, and Chester, not Mike, was the target. Beyond that, crime scene techs uncovered little physical evidence. There were no usable prints. The morning of the murders, it rained, so they couldn't lift any clear footprints or wheel marks from outside the structure. Now Baker was betting on Michael Sr. He knocked on the main door, hoping the heartbroken father might direct them. Baker and Cass joined Michael Sr. and Pat, Mike's mother, in the Zamidi living room a minute later. Both parents seemed shocked. Michael Sr. was shivering, as Pat sat silently crying. Baker saw them now and felt Cass had made the proper decision to send Michael Sr. home the day before. Even 24 hours later, they were too distraught to give precise answers. Baker opted to be brief. He first requested Michael Sr. to explain the body discovery again. The father gave the 911 dispatcher the same tale, all aligned. Baker proceeded to his actual purpose. He inquired whether anyone wanted to hurt Mike Jr. Michael Sr. shakily breathed. He noted that in the building industry, you sometimes encounter stiff competition. But he and his son always tried to get along with everyone. Fighting was terrible for business, he argued. But as he said this, he sat up taller, as if he had noticed something. He indicated a previous employee had a vengeance against them. It was his nephew, Hank Jennings. Hank sued the corporation a few years ago for unpaid overtime wages. They settled with Hank out of court, but the whole thing had sparked animosity. There was still much hatred. Mike Sr. glanced at his wife Pat, who nodded and said it had been difficult and turbulent. Baker meticulously recorded Hank's facts. After chatting with Mike's parents for a while, he and Cass left. Baker knew he would need to talk to the Zamidis again, but for now, he would give them room. He and Cass had a new lead. They'd investigate Hank Jennings. Baker returned to Cass's Wakefield Police Department office 2 days later to review crime scene images and witness accounts. He was getting restless. After meeting Mike's parents, he hoped Hank Jennings, the bitter cousin, would be their guy. They dispatched officers to find Hank for an interview, but they hadn't found him yet. They had reached Mike's wife Michelle and questioned her at home. She didn't give them much information. She said she was home with her kids when her husband was murdered. She claimed she didn't know anyone who had hurt him. Baker and Cass examined Allstate Concrete's financial records but found no mafia connections. Still, they were better off than a few days earlier. Detectives reviewing surveillance footage from businesses near Allstate discovered something. One security camera faced the street in front of the Allstate building. The angle wasn't right to show the company's parking lot. It recorded all street entry and leave vehicles from the parking lot. Cameras captured Mike Jr.'s truck arriving at work at 7:39 a.m. 5 minutes later, an unknown green pickup truck arrived at 7:44. A few minutes later, Chester Roberts arrived on foot. The same green truck left the parking lot at 7:50. 12 minutes passed before Michael Sr.'s red truck arrived at 8:02. Massive break. The killer probably drove that green truck and killed Mike and Chester between 7:44 and 7:50 a.m. The video quality didn't show the driver or license plate, but knowing the killer's likely vehicle's make and color was crucial. They could narrow their suspect list. Just then, the desk phone rang. Baker watched Cass grab it. After listening, Cass looked confused. He thanked the caller and promised to arrive. He hung up and faced Baker. He claimed Michelle Zamidi was calling. She called to share new information she hadn't shared in her first interview. She said it was crucial. Baker and Cass sat across from Michelle in her living room again 15 minutes later. Baker saw her as a different person. She appeared horrified and grieving 2 days earlier. She looked incredibly nervous now. She fidgeted with a stack of condolence cards on the coffee table, touching her hair. Baker mentioned the cards, and Michelle nodded. Many friends and neighbors from Wakefield and their second home in Freedom, New Hampshire, had reached out. Michelle breathed deeply and got to the point. They were denied information, she said. She described her Freedom neighbor, Sean Fitzpatrick. She acknowledged having an affair with him. Baker was dumbfounded. The case was transformed by a secret love triangle. Sean and Michelle had a strong reason to avoid Mike. Michelle revealed that her husband knew about the affair before Baker could ask a follow-up. She described the therapy and how they had worked hard to save their marriage. She said she broke up with Sean a month ago. She added that Sean was furious. Baker looked at Cass. They shared a thought. They must speak to Sean Fitzpatrick now. Michelle was once again the top suspect after this new information. Maybe she wanted her husband gone to be with her lover. She may have told them this now to control the story before they found out. More evidence is needed to prove any of that. Michelle gave Baker Sean's contact information and address, and Baker said they'd contact her. Later that night, Baker and Cass returned to her office. A second officer was ready to provide a vital update. Baker immediately sent officers to Freedom, New Hampshire to interview Sean Fitzpatrick after speaking with Michelle. One of those officers returned to Wakefield to report his findings. Baker wanted simple answers first. Has Sean Fitzpatrick owned a green truck? Officer shook his head. Sean had a bright red truck, he said. The officer stated that Sean denied having an affair with Michelle when questioned. He said he and Michelle were close, but just family friends. The officers interviewing him never revealed that they knew he was lying, and Michelle had confessed everything. Baker almost laughed at this. He initially doubted Sean's denial. His blatant lying made him look guilty. Before Baker could respond, the officer added another crucial detail: that Sean had a good alibi. One of his neighbors confirmed that he was at home in Freedom on the murder morning. This neighbor took a walk every morning at 9, and she remembered seeing Sean outside his house at that time. In frustration, Baker sighed. Freedom, New Hampshire to Wakefield, Massachusetts takes 2 hours. Sean could not have killed Mike and Chester by 7:50 a.m. in Wakefield and then at his Freedom home an hour and 10 minutes later. Physically impossible. Suddenly, Sean Fitzpatrick, their most promising lead, felt like another dead end. 5 days after the murders, Baker and Cass stood behind a Wakefield church on March 18. They attended Mike Zamidi's funeral. The church was packed, showing how much the community loved Mike. However, the two investigators weren't just paying respects. They finally spoke to Mike's cousin, Hank Jennings, who sued the company. Cass suggested they corner him at the funeral since they hadn't been able to reach him. Despite the animosity, he was family and would attend. Baker felt Cass nudge him as the mourners stood after the service. He leaned over and whispered their accuracy. He pointed to Hank in the crowd. As people left the pews, the two investigators caught Hank before he could leave. Baker immediately saw Hank's body tense up as they blocked his path. He seemed ready to flee. Baker cut to the chase. His eyes widened when he said, "Hank, we need you to come with us and answer some questions." He shook his head and said, "No way." "Not without my lawyer." He pushed past them and left the church. Baker and Cass didn't oppose him. They looked at each other. They considered Hank their main suspect due to his bizarre, evasive behavior. 5 weeks passed. State Trooper Kevin Baker sat in Detective Cass's office mid-April 2006. He carefully held a single sheet of paper in latex gloves. The ransom note looked like a movie prop. The page was covered with carefully cut and pasted newspaper letters. The letters warned, Close business now, or more family will die. They received the note from Mike Jr.'s mother, Pat. She said it arrived in their mail that morning. For the Zimetti family, this letter was terrifying. It wasn't just a cruel reminder of their son's murder, it threatened more violence. The note meant something else to Baker. They desperately needed a lead. Mike and Chester were killed over a month ago, and the investigation had stalled. Most of their initial suspects had been eliminated by this point, including Hank Jennings. They discovered his strange funeral behavior wasn't guilt-related. His settlement with the Zimettis included a non-disclosure agreement, so he was afraid of legal trouble if he told the police. His alibi was solid when they finally got him to sit down for a formal interview with his lawyer. His employer confirmed that he was at work during the murders. Hank owned several shotguns, but none were 1/6 gauge, the type used in the murders. Hank joined the growing pile of suspects. Michelle was in that pile. Given her affair, she had a motive, but she cooperated throughout the investigation. They couldn't find any evidence she was involved, directly or by hiring someone. A seemingly unbreakable alibi cleared her ex-lover, Sean Fitzpatrick, the most suspicious. He could not have been in two places. This threatening, ransom-style note seemed to confirm the investigation's initial theory that the murders were business-related and mob-related. Cass, a local, told Baker that rumors were spreading. Wakefield agreed that the mob theory made the most sense due to the Zimetti's big dig involvement. Baker wasn't convinced. They repeatedly examined the Zimettis' financial records and found no shady deals or mob ties. Additionally, this note felt wrong. A newspaper clipping note was silly and performative, not professional organization style. It seemed like someone was trying to make them think it was the mob to derail the investigation. Even if it was a red herring, the note was shocking. Because the sender may have left fingerprints or DNA on it, Baker carefully placed the note in an evidence bag. Cass sent it to the crime lab for analysis. Baker expected lab results to take time. While they waited, he re-interviewed every suspect and witness in case they missed a small, seemingly insignificant detail. Baker sat alone at Cass's desk a few days later, reading a witness statement for the 100th time. New evidence had re-energized the investigation, and he felt optimistic for the first time in weeks. They received preliminary forensic results from the threatening letter. Better yet, the lab found DNA and a partial palm print on the paper. Now, they needed a suspect to match it. The office door flew open, and an excited Detective Cass barged in. He had news after hanging up the phone. About Sean Fitzpatrick's alibi. The neighbor who walked every morning at 9 a.m. called the station. She wanted to modify her statement. She wasn't sure she saw Sean at 9. She thought she saw him later in the day after thinking about it. One phone call changed everything. A seemingly solid alibi had collapsed. Instantly, the murder day timeline was open. Sean could now have driven from Freedom to Wakefield, murdered, and returned. After realizing this, the investigators remembered another thing. The condolence cards on Michelle's coffee table came to mind. Baker and Cass walked up Michelle Zimetti's front steps an hour later. Knocked on her door. They asked for permission to enter and retrieve a small object from her home when she answered. As usual, Michelle agreed, confused but cooperative. After passing her, they found the condolence card they were looking for in that pile. The card was from Sean Fitzpatrick. They thanked Michelle, carefully placed the card and envelope in an evidence bag, and left. The crime lab received it directly. When the test results came back, Baker and Cass knew they had solved the case. Police believe this happened on the 13th of March 2006, based on the new timeline, DNA evidence, and witness statements. Sean Fitzpatrick silently climbed Mike Zimetti's office's metal staircase at 7:45 a.m. He carried a 1/6 gauge shotgun and had a racing heart. He was anxious but determined. His mind told him Mike Jr. must go. The only way, he entered the office without hesitation. It opened, and he raised the shotgun. Mike sat at his desk. He turned when the door opened and saw his neighbor, his wife's ex-lover, with a gun pointed at him, shocking and confusing him. Sean shot Mike in the face and chest before he could react. Mike sank in his chair, dead. Sean ran down the stairs, adrenaline rushing. However, he froze at the bottom of the stairs. He heard outside footsteps approaching the building's side door. Others were coming. Sean instinctively hid in the shadows of the large garage, his mind racing to see who it was. A man entered shortly after the door opened. It was Chester Roberts. Sean jumped out of his hiding spot and shot Chester in the back before he could react. Chester fell silently. Sean stood stunned for a moment. He hadn't intended to kill again. Mike alone was targeted. Now another body lay on the floor. He couldn't stay. More people may arrive at any time. He ran from the building and jumped into the green pickup truck he stole from a Freedom neighbor who was away. He left the Allstate concrete parking lot in under 10 minutes. He drove with white-knuckled steering wheel grip. He felt terrible about what he did and knew he should feel guilty. However, he only felt profound relief. Now, he believed he could be with his soulmate. When Michelle tried to break up with Sean, she told him she would only leave her husband if Mike did or suffered. Michelle did it to end the affair and let him down easy. Sean saw it as a suggestion and green light. So he did something to Mike. The pieces fell into place after Sean's alibi collapsed. He licked the envelope of his condolence card to Michelle, leaving DNA that matched the ransom-style letter. Sean wrote and sent that letter to deceive the police into thinking the murders were a professional mob hit. June 2006 saw Sean Fitzpatrick arrested. After being convicted of murdering Michael Zamiti Jr. and Chester Roberts, he received 2 life sentences. The Zamiti family had to deal with the loss of their son and the betrayal of a friend. Chester Roberts' family mourned an innocent man who was killed for arriving on time to work. Many thanks for watching. Comment your thoughts on today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. One afternoon in early September of 2004, a 20-year-old student named Derek Keeper sat alone in the newspaper lab at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, furiously typing an opinion article that he believed would make people angry. Years later, people would look back on those exact words and realize something terrifying. Because without knowing it, Derek was writing about the very thing that would eventually kill him. And, strangely, Derek's story would not be the only one like that. Years later, on the other side of the world, another man would confidently make a decision he believed would impress everyone around him. Instead, that single decision would trap thousands of people inside a sinking cruise ship in the middle of the night. At first, these two stories seem completely unrelated. One is about a college student in Nebraska. The other is about the captain of a luxury cruise ship off the coast of Italy. But both men shared the exact same dangerous belief. They were absolutely convinced they were right. And even when warning signs appeared directly in front of them, neither one backed down. So what happens when confidence slowly turns into recklessness? And how can a single decision made in just a few seconds quietly set the stage for disaster long before anyone realizes what's coming? Derek was the kind of person who was involved in everything. He was a member of a fraternity. He was also a senator in the student government, where he was known for his passionate arguments and strong opinions. On top of that, he worked as a research assistant for the university library. And somehow, he was also pursuing 5 different majors. It seemed like he was trying to do everything all at once. Derek took every single one of his commitments very, very seriously. He was not the kind of person to do something halfway. But the column he was writing right now, this was the one thing he had the most fun with. It was his outlet. Derek came from a small city in Nebraska. And while he had always been a loud and opinionated person in his private life, he'd never really had a proper platform to share all the big ideas and viewpoints that were constantly swirling in his head. This column for the Daily Nebraskan gave him that chance. It was his opportunity to finally present these ideas to the thousands of students at the university. He hoped his words would spark lively discussions and debates all around campus. After all, Derek loved a good debate more than anything. He thrived on it. So he would intentionally choose to write about really complex, often controversial issues. He knew these topics would get his readers fired up. He wrote about the ongoing war in Iraq. He wrote about the future of the Republican Party. He wrote about all the things he believed were wrong with local politics. The tone he used when he wrote about these contentious subjects was always very sarcastic. It was blunt, and it was deliberately provocative. He enjoyed creating a stir, getting people to passionately disagree with him, and they almost always did. It was common for the newspaper to receive furious letters to the editor after one of Derek's columns was published. Sometimes he'd even get personal hate mail. But Derek was never bothered by any of that. In a way, getting people that riled up was exactly what he was aiming for. It meant they were listening. It meant his words had an impact. And he was absolutely certain that the article he was writing right now, in this moment, was going to be even more divisive than anything he had written before. For Derek, the central theme that connected all of his beliefs was individual freedom. He was a fierce advocate for encouraging people to say no to what he saw as government overreach in their daily lives. That was his core principle, the thing that inspired him to write in the first place. This particular column he was working on was about a set of state and federal laws that he felt tried to control personal choice. He believed these laws infringed on a person's right to decide what was best for their own body, and he was arguing for them to be abolished completely. Now, to be clear, the stakes for this specific issue were literally life and death. But in Derek's view, the most fundamental freedom of being an American was the right to make your own decisions, even if those decisions meant risking your own personal safety. That was a risk he believed everyone should be free to take. And so, as Derek furiously typed away, he wasn't just stating his opinion, he was trying to rally people. He was encouraging everyone, from fellow students to senators and politicians, to have the same kind of intensity that he had about this issue. He wanted them to be fully bought in on this idea of American individual freedom. Finally, after what felt like hours of intense focus, he typed the last word. He leaned back in his chair, the squeak of the plastic echoing in the quiet corner of the lab. He took a deep breath and began to proofread the entire article from the beginning. He read each sentence carefully, making sure his arguments were sharp and his tone was just right. When he got to the very last line, he felt a genuine chill run down his spine. It said, quote, "I just wish we could keep the government out of our pocketbooks and out of our personal decisions." Derek loved that line. It was simple, direct, and powerful. He nodded to himself, a small, satisfied smile on his face. He had nailed it. He attached the document to an email and sent his draft to his editor. Derek's article went to print just a few days later, on the 17th of September 2004. And just as he had predicted, it caused an immediate uproar. Like most of his other articles, this one generated a flood of angry emails and letters from people who strongly disagreed with what he had to say. They called him reckless. They called him irresponsible. But all the anger, all the vitriol in these messages just proved to Derek that his article had been a huge success. He had sparked outrage. He had gotten people talking and arguing about this issue, which was exactly what he wanted. Derek even hoped that maybe some of the readers got angry enough to actually take action. That was his ultimate goal. He wanted his writing to genuinely inspire people, to make them think, and maybe even to change their behavior. The rest of Derek's semester was a total blur of activity. He kept writing his weekly column, piling it on top of all his other obligations. He had classes for his 5 majors, fraternity meetings, student government sessions, and his job at the library. Then came final exams. Before he knew it, the semester was over, and he was on his way to his mother's house in Texas for the Christmas break. A few weeks later, on the very early morning of the 4th of January, 2005, at around 3 a.m., Derek was riding in the back seat of a Ford Explorer SUV. He was on his way back to school after the break. He had caught a ride from his mother's home with two of his fraternity brothers who were sitting up front. The driver was focused on the dark road ahead, and the other friend was in the passenger seat trying to stay awake. It was an awful 13-hour-long drive. Derek had spent the first part of the trip doing what he did best. He was using his sharp sarcasm to make his friends laugh. He was engaging them in really animated conversations about politics, school, and their plans for the upcoming semester. For the first 6 or 8 hours, the time had sort of flown by. But now, it was the middle of the night, and a heavy silence had fallen over the car. Everybody was just completely exhausted from the truly awful, long, monotonous drive. All any of them wanted to do at this point was just get back to campus, get out of the car, and sleep in their own beds. Eventually, they were getting close. They had finally crossed into Nebraska and were driving down Interstate 80. It was a snowy, cold highway, and the landscape outside the windows was dark and bleak. The university was not far now. Derek was genuinely excited to start the new semester. He'd had a nice, laid-back holiday. He had caught up on a lot of sleep and spent a lot of time just hanging out with his younger siblings. But Derek was not the kind of person who liked slowing down for very long. He was already feeling restless, eager to get back to his busy, structured life on campus. He was especially looking forward to getting back to writing his column. During his downtime over the break, he had brainstormed a bunch of potential new topics, but he wasn't sure if any of his new ideas were going to top the very controversial article that he had published back in September. People on campus were still talking about that one. And Derek was still thinking about it too. In fact, his own words, his own advice to his readers were still ringing in his ears. They weren't just words on a page for him, they were a philosophy that guided his everyday decisions. But for now, with the campus just a few miles away, Derek just leaned his head up against the cold glass of the window and waited for this long trip to finally be over. He closed his eyes for a moment, the low hum of the engine and the tires on the pavement lulling him. But then, suddenly, he felt the SUV lurch violently to one side. Before he even had time to process what was happening, he heard a deafening bang as metal scraped against asphalt. He heard his friends in the front seats screaming. The world outside the window became a spinning blur of darkness and snow. Just a few minutes later, a police officer was flying down that same stretch of Interstate 80 inches, his cruiser, his lights flashing, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. He had gotten a call about a single vehicle rollover. As he got closer to the location, he saw a group of ambulances parked on the side of the road, their own emergency lights bathing the snowy landscape in red and blue. He knew that's where he needed to go. So, he pulled his cruiser over to the side and stopped behind the last ambulance. When he got out, the bitter cold hit him instantly. He saw it then. In a ditch just off the highway was an overturned SUV, its wheels pointing up at the dark sky. The officer immediately jumped out of his cruiser and rushed towards the wreck. When he got there, the scene was absolutely chaotic. A team of paramedics was already at the window of the SUV, trying to assess the condition of the victims inside and figure out the best way to get them out. The officer knelt down to look inside as well. Through the shattered glass, he could clearly see two people inside the vehicle. They were the two young men who had been in the front. Both of them seemed, for the most part, okay. Obviously, they had been in a serious wreck. They were banged up, covered in small cuts, and clearly dazed and in shock. But their injuries didn't look immediately life-threatening. Relieved, the officer backed away to let the paramedics do their work. He started taking in the rest of the scene, getting ready to secure the area and start his report. But then, very quickly, the officer noticed that more paramedics were running right past the SUV. They were heading towards something on the ground a few feet beyond it, deeper in the snowy ditch. The officer's feeling of relief vanished. He followed them to see what it was they were running to. And when he saw what was on the ground, the officer just stopped. He was a veteran officer, he had seen a lot in his career, and he knew instinctively that there was nothing anyone could do for the person lying there. It was the body of a young man, clearly the third passenger from the SUV. His body was mangled, almost beyond recognition, from being thrown from the vehicle during the crash. It would turn out that Derek Keeper had been right. His September 17th highly contentious column in the Daily Nebraskan would be his most controversial and famous piece ever. In fact, people are still talking about it today. Because his column, the one he was so proud of, the one that argued that Americans have the right to make their own choices about their bodies and their personal safety, was about one law in particular. Derek believed that the law forcing people to wear a seatbelt was a direct infringement on that right. Derek despised this requirement. He thought the choice to wear a seatbelt should be a personal decision about risk and safety, not a mandate from the government. To him, it wasn't just about buckling up. It was about individual choice. It was about freedom. And on January 4th, when the SUV that Derek was riding in hit a patch of black ice on the road, the driver lost control. The driver and the other passenger in the front seat were wearing their seatbelts. But Derek, in the back seat, in keeping with his deeply held beliefs, was not. And so, when the SUV crashed and flipped over, Derek alone was ejected from the vehicle. Derek alone was killed. As one reporter later pointed out, Derek Keeper lived by his beliefs, and he also died by them. As tragic as Derek Keeper's story was, he was far from the only person whose deeply held beliefs would end in disaster. Because sometimes the most catastrophic decisions are made by people who are absolutely convinced they are in control. And in 2012, on the coast of Italy, one man's reckless confidence would lead to one of the most infamous maritime disasters in modern history. Just before 9 p.m. on Friday, the 13th of January, 2012, a 51-year-old man named Francesco Schettino and his girlfriend, Dominica, sat at a table in a crowded restaurant. They were at a massive resort in Italy, and they had been there for a while, enjoying a long, leisurely meal. Their table was covered with empty dishes, a half-empty wine decanter, and plates with the last remnants of their amazing food. Now, having an extended, indulgent dinner like this one was not technically allowed since Francesco was actually on the clock. But Francesco wasn't too worried about breaking what he considered to be a small rule. Because he wasn't just some hired hand at this resort. He was in charge of the entire thing. He was the boss. The resort was on Italy's beautiful Tuscan coast, and it was incredible. It was literally right out on the water. It had thousands of guest rooms, 6 different restaurants, and over a dozen bars. It had a full-size theater, multiple swimming pools, and there was even a casino on board. It had a huge capacity for guests. And right at that moment, there were easily more than 3,000 people staying there. Francesco was very proud to be the man in charge of this unbelievable place. He had actually started working at this resort years ago as a simple security guard. But he was ambitious, and he had worked his way all the way up to the very top. He had now been overseeing this property for about 6 years. Being a leader, being the one who gave the orders, really suited his personality. He loved being impressive. He loved feeling important. He had heard the whispers from his staff and from former coworkers. They complained that he was too over the top, that he was a bit of a show-off. He had heard all of it. But in Francesco's mind, these people were just jealous. He was handsome. He had a great high-paying job. And he had 2 beautiful, amazing women in his life when some people didn't even have one. And so now, Francesco smiled at one of those women, Dominica, who sat across the table from him. They were sharing a dessert. Francesco was married, but recently, Dominica had become the most important woman in his life. She was a dancer, and to him, she was just perfect. They had only met a few weeks ago, so they were still in that honeymoon phase of their relationship. They were both still very flirtatious and constantly eager to impress one another. Right now, Francesco knew he should probably leave the restaurant and get back to his managing duties. But he was having so much fun with Dominica. He didn't want the night to end. So he lingered, eating his dessert as slowly as he possibly could. But as he sat there, slowly dragging his spoon through the tiramisu, an idea started to form in his head. He realized that their night together didn't actually have to end just because dinner was over. There was something he could do right now that would give them maybe another hour or so together. And it wasn't just that. This idea would also completely blow Dominika away. It would prove to her beyond any doubt just how amazing and powerful he really was. So suddenly, a big smile spread across his face. He looked at Dominika and told her to hurry up and finish eating because they needed to get upstairs immediately. He had a surprise for her. A few minutes later, Francesco and Dominika hurried into the resort's top-floor operations center. And just like the entire rest of the place, this room, despite being an operations center, was still massively impressive. In addition to all the new high-tech equipment, the monitors showing security feeds, the glowing digital maps all over the room, there was this huge window. It took up almost an entire wall and overlooked an exterior balcony that looked down on the dark ocean below. It was a beautiful, sweeping view of the water, and it even overlooked a stretch of small, twinkling seaside villages on the coast called Giglio. The room was also filled with all of Francesco's employees. They were hustling around, staring at screens, and talking quietly into headsets. But as soon as Francesco and Dominika walked in, Francesco strode to the center of the room. He clapped his hands together, getting everybody's attention, and told them all to listen up. Then, he went over the details of his big idea. The resort was going to put on a very specific and spectacular kind of show. It was called a salute, and they were going to do it right now. Salutes were a very popular tradition in this particular area of Italy, and Francesco's resort actually did them all the time, so this wasn't a totally unusual request. They were basically a kind of performance, mostly for the benefit of the locals on shore. The resort would flash all of its lights and play loud music, while the guests of the resort would be encouraged to go to their balconies and wave and cheer to the residents and the other tourists in the villages of Giglio. But critically, salutes needed to be both quick and highly choreographed. That's the only way they worked. They were complex maneuvers. In order for a salute to be successful, it required the full attention and active participation from a large number of people on the staff. It was a big to-do. And given the fact that these were such a big endeavor, it meant that a lot could go wrong if you weren't extremely careful. Francesco actually had a mentor, a more experienced manager, who had actively discouraged him from doing these salutes. He had told Francesco to do as few of them as possible because of the risk involved. But Francesco's mentor wasn't physically here right now to tell him to stop. And the people who were here, his staff, seemed pretty excited about his spontaneous idea. So Francesco began going over the plan with them. And as he expected, with such a complicated undertaking, there were a lot of logistics to look over, a lot of charts to check. However, when Francesco actually started trying to go over these preparations, he realized he had a problem. He couldn't actually read anything. He hadn't brought his glasses with him. He didn't think he looked handsome when he wore them, so he had left them in his room before going out to dinner with Dominika. But now, he really needed them to read the fine print on the navigational charts. Thinking on his feet, Francesco simply turned to a junior staff member and asked him to read aloud whatever information he really needed to know in order to perform this salute. The staff member, a bit surprised, did as he was told. He read off the key data points and the recommended course adjustments. At the end of it, Francesco felt like he had heard what he needed to hear. He thought everything was in order. He nodded confidently and said, "Okay, we are all set to begin." Then he looked over at Dominika and gave her a smile and a little nod, as if to say, "Okay, here we go." "Get ready to be amazed." She smiled back, knowing that whatever was coming next was going to be really, really special. When Francesco gave the actual order to begin the salute, everybody in the operations room jumped into action. As soon as the salute officially began, Francesco squinted, trying to see through the huge window that looked out over the ocean and the village of Giglio down below. Francesco was so excited when he thought about how everyone who was out and about in town would look up and see his palace, all lit up and full of life and energy. He imagined their awe. But as he peered at the distant lights of Giglio, he realized something wasn't quite right. Even without his glasses on, he could see that there was something out there in the darkness, just barely illuminated by the town's lights. It was a large, dark shape right between his resort and Giglio. And to his growing horror, Francesco realized it was actually getting closer, and it was getting closer fast. At the exact same time, but on the other side of the resort, an American man named Brian Aho was eating dinner with his wife and their teenage daughter. They were in the Milano restaurant, which was one of the 6 main restaurants in the resort. They had just been enjoying their meal, talking about their vacation, when there was a deafening, grinding, banging sound. The entire room gave a huge, violent jolt, and everything inside just went flying. Brian instinctively grabbed the table to brace himself as plates and glasses shot off the tabletop and shattered on the floor all around them. Then he heard screams and the thud of people hitting the ground as other diners were literally thrown from their chairs. And then there was another series of loud crashes as some of the decorative ceiling panels came loose from above and smashed down onto the ground. But then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. The shaking abruptly stopped. Brian immediately jumped up to make sure that his wife and daughter were okay. They did seem to be fine, just dazed and terrified like everybody else in the room. As Brian stood up, he could tell he was mostly okay too, just shaken up. But the overwhelming thought in his mind was just having no idea what had just happened. He looked around the chaotic dining room, and no one seemed to know. It had felt like some kind of earthquake. But then Brian thought, if this had been an earthquake, he really had to get his family out of this restaurant immediately in case of aftershocks. It seemed like all the other diners clearly had the same idea. Before Brian could even really decide what to do, there was a surge of activity around him as dozens of people just began rushing towards the main exit of the restaurant. Brian didn't want him or his family to get caught in the middle of that huge, panicked crowd. A panicked group of people could easily create a stampede, and he was worried that he and his family could get pulled to the ground and trampled in the chaos. So he quickly looked around and saw on the other side of the restaurant a smaller service door that nobody else was going to. He pointed to it, and he and his family began making their way over to it. But before they could actually get through this door, the main overhead lights in the restaurant began to flicker. And then they went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. And with the darkness suddenly came the loud, piercing blast of emergency alarms echoing through the resort. And then he could hear more screams, not just from inside this restaurant, but from all over the place. It sounded like the entire resort had devolved into madness. Brian had never been more scared in his whole life. His pulse was racing faster than he thought was even possible, and he almost felt paralyzed, like this was just too much to even process. He, like basically everyone else, had no clue what was really going on here. Navigating his family through an emergency was already going to be horrifying and dangerous. But now he would also have to do it in the dark. For a long moment, Brian and his family just stood there, frozen in the dark. Brian was about to tell his family to just go through the door, that they'd figure it out in the dark. But then, luckily, the emergency lights flickered on, giving the room a dim, eerie glow. It wasn't much, but it was enough to see, enough to guide their way. At that point, Brian didn't wait. He grabbed his wife and his daughter, pushed through the side door, and they headed out into a long, narrow hallway. It would take nearly 10 minutes for Brian and his family to navigate the maze of hallways they had just walked into. The floor felt strange beneath their feet, like it was tilted at a slight angle. Finally, they found a door that led outside, and they stepped out into the open air. But when they finally got out there, Brian realized they actually had a really big problem. The exit they had just taken hadn't led them to safety. It had led them to an expansive outdoor terrace with a railing on the 4th floor of the resort. This meant they still needed to get down multiple levels in order to evacuate safely. But just being on the 4th floor wasn't the biggest issue. The big issue was that the terrace was already packed with hundreds of other people, other guests from the resort who were also trying to evacuate. There were all these people basically blocking their way to any potential staircase. Everybody who had no idea what was going on was just pushing and shoving each other. There were no authority figures, no staff members around to actually direct what was now clearly an evacuation. Brian could tell that the crowd was starting to panic, and honestly, he was too. Everyone was just shouting, "What's happening? What's going on?" And so Brian was about to suggest to his family that they turn around and try to find another way out when they heard the crackling of the resort's public speaker system. A calm voice came on and finally delivered some information about what was happening. The voice said that there had been an electrical blackout, but everything was fine. Technicians were hard at work trying to fix the problem. So, in the meantime, all the guests should stay calm and just go back to their rooms for safety. At this point, it was very obvious that the mood all around Brian and his family completely changed. People stopped pushing and arguing and panicking. The tension on the terrace just seemed to dissolve. Brian himself felt that tight knot of dread in his stomach loosen a bit. An electrical blackout didn't seem like a life-or-death situation. So, he, and clearly everybody else, felt a whole lot less scared. Pretty much right away, many of the guests began heading back inside, making their way back to their rooms. Brian even spotted a few staff members who had appeared in the crowd, encouraging people to do just that. Go back to your rooms, everything is under control. And so for a few moments, Brian and his family and the others who remained just kind of stayed put, watching things settle back down. But then, with no warning at all, there was another huge banging sound from deep within the structure of the resort. The floor once again buckled violently under Brian's feet. And this triggered a whole new wave of just absolute chaos out on the terrace. All at once, everybody started shouting and pushing each other again, this time in pure, unfiltered panic. At the same time, there were all these new frantic announcements coming out over the loudspeaker, but it wasn't doing anything. It was like the crowd had collectively decided that something was very, very wrong, and no one could tell them otherwise. They had to leave, right now. And so at this point, you had a group of people who were still out on the terrace who decided to charge back into the resort to try to find another way to evacuate. And you also had the group of people who had already gone back inside to go to their rooms who had now changed their minds, and they charged right back out onto the terrace. For a moment, it was like these two massive waves of people just smashed into each other. Brian and his family were kind of off to the side because they had just barely stepped out onto the terrace when all this was happening. But then Brian watched in complete shock as he saw some of the people, after they pushed and fought their way all the way to the edge of the terrace, to the railing, they began climbing over it. They were going to try to climb down the outside of the resort from the 4th floor. Seeing this was horrifying for Brian. But then he felt yet another powerful shudder under his feet and a loud industrial groaning sound from the resort right behind him. And he knew in that instant, if he didn't do what these other people were doing, he and his family might not be able to evacuate. Clearly, there was a real, serious problem. They didn't know what it was, but they had to go. So, he grabbed his wife and his daughter's hands, and he shoved his way through the panicked crowd to the railing. Over the railing they went, and down they began to climb. Meanwhile, back up in the top-level operations center, Francesco Schettino was staring out the room's huge window, just completely frozen in shock. His resort was in complete pandemonium below. Guests were running everywhere. Others were fighting and shoving each other. And some were literally leaping to their potential deaths from the upper-level balconies and terraces. As Francesco watched all of this carnage unfold, he tried to wrap his head around how the night had gone so horrifically wrong. The worst part of all of it was that there was absolutely no way to fix it. He had been trying to show Dominica and everybody else how amazing and impressive and in control he was. But now he had completely lost control of this whole situation. He'd also lost his girlfriend because Dominica had quickly fled the resort as soon as the chaos started. Then there was another loud crashing sound somewhere in the distance. His heart pounded in his chest, and he realized it was time for him to start running too. Minutes later, Francesco and some of his senior staff were sprinting through the halls of the resort. And as they ran, thunderous noises and bangs came from every direction. The floor was tilted at an impossible angle. Debris from the ceiling and walls crashed to the ground all around them, shaken loose by the constant shuddering. And all the while, over the noise, Francesco could hear the continuous, terrified shrieks of panic from people who were still clearly trapped inside the resort and just couldn't get out. But he and the others he was with finally did make it to an exit. And this particular exit was not overrun with panicking people. So Francesco was lucky enough to be able to pretty quickly make it to the bottom level and then keep on going. And he did not look back, not until he was far, far away and what he believed was a safe distance. But when he did finally stop running, and he did turn around and look back at his resort, his stomach pitched so hard he nearly vomited. Because finally, standing on solid ground, he could see right in front of him the full, horrible extent of what he had done. It would turn out that what Francesco was looking at was the culmination of a record number of terrible choices he had made that night. One, Francesco would later deny this, but he was seen drinking alcohol at dinner while he was supposed to be working. Two, he was not wearing his glasses, which meant he was his most handsome self, but also that he couldn't see very well. And three, he was distracted by his new girlfriend, who he had brought to an area where only key personnel were allowed, all because he was desperate to impress her. Now, in most workplaces, this would all just be considered unprofessional and maybe might get you fired. But in Francesco's workplace, it was much, much worse than that. What he had done was incredibly dangerous. Because the resort that Francesco managed was not a regular hotel, it was a gigantic cruise ship called the Costa Concordia. Francesco was its captain. And when he issued the order for the boat to do a salute, he was not just ordering a complicated but entertaining show. A cruise ship salute also involves steering the massive 114,000-ton boat much closer to shore than usual to appropriately show off to the locals on land. But because Francesco literally couldn't see very well, was obviously distracted, and possibly drunk, he didn't notice that when they performed this salute, they were going way too fast and way, way too close to the shore of Giglio. That dark shape he saw rushing towards them in the darkness was an enormous cluster of underwater rocks. By the time he saw it, it was far too late to turn. The Costa Concordia had smashed into the rocks, tearing a 230-foot-wide hole in the side of the hull, which immediately began flooding the ship's engine rooms with seawater. And then, making matters even worse, Francesco delayed the rescue efforts for more than an hour by trying to convince everyone that what had happened was just a simple electrical outage. And then, when he finally did issue an evacuation order, he broke the most sacred rule for any ship captain. He fled the boat before the remainder of his crew and all the passengers. He was one of the first people to get into a lifeboat. He did not go down with his ship. That American passenger, Brian Apgar, and his family would survive. Because after they made the terrifying decision to go over the railing, they perilously climbed down 4 levels of the tilting, sinking ship all the way to a lifeboat. And so they survived. But unfortunately, 32 other people who were on board the boat that night ultimately died. All because of Francesco Schettino's reckless desire to show off for his girlfriend. Francesco himself was ultimately arrested for manslaughter and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. In the aftermath, he was subsequently named Captain Coward by the press and became known as Italy's most hated man. The terrifying part about both of these cases is that neither disaster began with evil intentions. They began with confidence, with ego, with the belief that nothing bad was going to happen. Thank you so much for watching. And if you want to see more stories where ordinary decisions spiral into unbelievable tragedies, we have an entire playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time. Before dawn on a quiet Saturday in March of 1997, a police captain was making his final patrol through the sleeping outskirts of a small town in North Carolina. The road, a stretch of highway that connected the town to the larger city of Charlotte, was almost completely empty. But up ahead, the captain saw something that didn't belong. There was a red Jeep, parked oddly on the shoulder of the road, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. It was just sitting there. This was suspicious enough for the captain to slow down and pull his patrol car in behind it. He got out, the air cool and still, and started walking towards the Jeep. As he got closer, he could hear the low hum of the engine. It was still running. He saw the driver's side window was all the way down. But when he walked around to that side of the vehicle and shined his flashlight inside, he saw that nobody was there. The driver's seat was empty. The whole car was empty. He stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. And then a sound cut through the quiet. A cell phone, sitting on the passenger seat, began to ring. In the early morning hours of Saturday, the 29th of March 1997, a 26-year-old waitress named Kim Medlin was finishing up her shift. She worked at a topless bar in Charlotte called the Men's Club, and tonight she was wearing a leotard and tights as she carried a tray of filet mignons through the bustling, smoke-filled room. She navigated past the main stage, where women were dancing, and delivered the food to a table of businessmen. Kim worked here 3 or 4 nights a week, and for the most part, she didn't mind the job. The money was very good, and working the late shift meant her days were completely free. That freedom was important, because it let her focus on the 2 things she loved most in the world: taking care of her horses and turning her brand new house into a home. Kim and her husband Bridger had just achieved a major life goal. They'd bought a beautiful 7-acre plot of land just outside the nearby town of Monroe, which was where Bridger had grown up. They spent the better part of the last year building their dream home from the ground up. They even built a barn for their 3 horses. Now, with all the heavy construction finally done, they were in the middle of moving in, unpacking boxes, and making the place their own. As Kim delivered the steaks, she glanced up at a clock on the wall. She saw she had less than an hour to go, and a little wave of excitement went through her. She had the next 3 days off, and she had big plans. Simple plans, but they were all that mattered to her. She was going to finish unpacking the last of the boxes and finally start hanging pictures on the walls. She flashed the businessmen a quick, professional smile, and then moved on to check her other tables. An hour later, just a little after 2 in the morning, Kim walked out the back entrance of the club. She'd changed out of her work uniform and was now wearing a comfortable, baggy sweatshirt. She called out a quick goodbye to a few of her coworkers who were lingering outside, and then walked over to her red Jeep parked along the side of the building. She climbed inside, tossed her purse onto the cow print seat cover on the passenger seat, started the engine, and turned on some music for the hour-long drive home. About 30 minutes later, Kim was driving south down Old Charlotte Highway. It was a secluded 2-lane road that was pretty much completely deserted at this time of night. She used to find this part of her commute relaxing, a quiet time to decompress after a long shift. But lately, driving this road alone late at night had started to make her nervous. The reason was because just a couple of weeks earlier, while driving home from work around this exact same time, she'd been involved in a really scary road rage incident. Another car had come up fast from behind her and started tailgating her aggressively. They were flashing their lights and honking their horns over and over again for absolutely no reason. Kim had been terrified. She thought maybe it was a customer from the club who had followed her, and her mind started racing with all the terrible possibilities. It freaked her out so much that when she saw the lights of a convenience store up ahead, she immediately pulled into the parking lot. Her heart was pounding, but then she felt a huge sense of relief. There was a police car parked right there. She didn't hesitate. She got out of her Jeep and went straight over to the officer to explain what had just happened and ask for help. He was very kind and took her seriously. He promised he would go try to track down the driver who had been harassing her. He even sent out a broadcast over the police radio telling all the other officers on duty to keep an eye out for Kim's red Jeep on the night she was working, just in case anyone ever gave her trouble again. The road rager was never caught, but knowing that the local police were aware of her situation and were looking out for her did make Kim feel a little bit better. Still, the fear lingered. The person was still out there. So tonight, as she drove down that same dark, empty highway, she decided to do something to calm her nerves. She reached into her purse fished out her cell phone, and called her husband, Bridger. When Bridger answered, he told her he was actually on the road too. He worked as a DJ, and tonight he'd had a gig at a high school prom in a town about 2 hours away. He was just finishing his own drive home. They chatted for a few minutes, the easy conversation of a married couple just checking in. Then, Bridger told Kim that he was just pulling into their driveway. He said he would run inside, get settled, and call her right back. Kim agreed, said goodbye, and they hung up. She kept driving, feeling a little more at ease now. About 15 minutes passed. It was now a little before 3 in the morning. Her phone rang again. Just as he promised, it was Bridger calling her back from the house. He asked her where she was, if she was close. She told him she was just passing the Union Station restaurant, a local landmark. That meant she was only about 20 minutes away from home. Bridger said he was exhausted from his long night and was about to head to bed. Just in case he was already asleep by the time she walked in the door, he wished her a good night. Kim said goodnight back, told him she loved him, and then she hung up the phone, placing it down on the passenger seat beside her purse. She turned her full attention back to the dark road ahead. But just as she did, a sudden, blindingly bright light filled her car. She instinctively glanced up at her rearview mirror and saw a pair of headlights right on her tail. An hour later, Bridger Medlin sat up in bed. He looked over at the clock on his nightstand. It read 3:59 a.m. It had been a full hour since he'd spoken to Kim. She should have been home 40 minutes ago. She was only 20 minutes away when they talked. A knot of worry started to form in his stomach. He got out of bed and walked through their new 2-story house, checking every room, calling out her name, but Kim wasn't there. There was no sign that she had ever come home. Bridger looked out the front window. Her red Jeep wasn't in the driveway either. Now he was starting to panic. He hurried into the kitchen, picked up the landline, and dialed Kim's cell phone number. The phone rang a few times, and then a man's voice answered. It wasn't a voice he recognized. Confused, Bridger asked who was speaking. The man on the other end told him he was a police officer with the Monroe Public Safety Department. Bridger's heart sank. He asked the officer, "Okay, well, where's my wife?" The officer's reply was not reassuring. He told Bridger that he didn't know where his wife was. He had just come across a red Jeep idling on the side of the highway. He found the phone inside, and when it started ringing, he just answered it. But as for the driver, he said, "There's nobody here." A few minutes later, so a little after 4 a.m., on March 29th, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk, an investigator with the Monroe Public Safety Department, was driving north along Old Charlotte Highway. He drove past the closed businesses and dark houses until he reached the very edge of town. And then he saw it. Up ahead, a red Jeep parked on the shoulder of the opposite side of the road. There was a patrol car parked right behind it, its lights quietly flashing. Hulk made a U-turn and pulled his own car onto the shoulder. As he got out, he saw Captain David Simpson standing there waiting for him. Simpson quickly filled him in. He'd found the Jeep idling there about 15 minutes ago. Headlights on, engine running, but totally empty. He said he was about to call it in when the cell phone on the passenger seat started to ring. He answered it on instinct, and it was a man named Bridger Medlin, frantically looking for his wife, Kim. Captain Simpson also told Hulk something else that was important. He said he actually recognized the Jeep. He remembered it from a strange run-in he'd had just 2 weeks earlier, outside a convenience store with Kim Medlin herself. He put 2 and 2 together. This was definitely Kim's car, but Kim was nowhere to be found. The name Kim Medlin also rang a bell for Assistant Chief Hulk, but for a different reason. He actually happened to be personal friends with her husband, Bridger. This case was already personal. Hulk pulled out his flashlight and began to carefully look inside the Jeep. Right away, he saw a wallet lying open on the passenger seat. He picked it up and looked inside. There were credit cards and there was cash. But the clear plastic slot in the wallet, the spot where you'd slide in your driver's license, was empty. It looked like the license had been deliberately taken out. The initial theory that popped into their heads was a traffic stop. Maybe Kim got pulled over by an officer and had taken her license out to hand it over. But in a small department like Monroe's, there were only a handful of officers on duty at this hour. Hulk asked Captain Simpson if any of the on-duty officers had reported pulling someone over that night. Simpson was already ahead of him. He had already checked. And the answer was no. None of their officers had made a traffic stop. This immediately made Hulk wonder about something else. Maybe Kim had been pulled over by someone posing as a cop. These so-called blue light bandits weren't common, but there had been reports over the years of criminals using flashing lights to pull over and harass drivers, especially young women driving alone. It was a disturbing thought, but those cases were rare. Hulk didn't want to jump to any conclusions just yet. Just then, Hulk heard the rumble of a truck engine and saw another set of headlights approaching up the highway. He set the wallet back down in the seat and walked over as a black pickup truck pulled to a stop right behind his car. A tall man with blonde hair jumped out of the driver's seat. Hulk knew him immediately. It was his friend and Kim's husband, Bridger. Bridger looked frantic, his eyes wide with fear and panic. He rushed towards Hulk, demanding to know what had happened to his wife. Hulk tried to calm him down, explaining that they were there to figure that out. He told Bridger what they had found so far, just the car, with no broken windows, no slashed tires, no obvious signs of a struggle. He suggested that it was possible Kim had just run into some car trouble and had walked off to find help. But Bridger wasn't listening. Without asking for permission, he pushed right past Hulk and climbed directly into the driver's seat of the Jeep. He said, "Well, let's test your theory right now and see if the car was working." Hulk, stunned, told him to get out of the Jeep, that it was a potential crime scene. But Bridger completely ignored him. He put his wife's car in drive and moved it forward a few inches. Then he put it in reverse and backed it up, parking it right back in its original spot. He'd just proven the car worked perfectly fine. And in the process, he had potentially destroyed any evidence that might have been there. Hulk was annoyed, but he also couldn't help but think, this is very bad. Whatever happened here, it wasn't car trouble. Something was seriously wrong. Hulk walked over to his patrol car and radioed the dispatcher for reinforcements. He specifically asked for a police dog so they could try to track Kim's scent in case she had left the area on foot. A few minutes later, 2 more police cars arrived, and a few officers and a canine handler with his dog got out. Hulk opened the doors to the Jeep, and the dog jumped inside, sniffing around the seats and the floor, getting familiar with the scent of Kim and her belongings. After a moment, the dog seemed to pick up a trail on the ground next to the car. The officers told Bridger, who was pacing back and forth and clearly wanted to follow them, to stay put by his truck. Then, they followed the dog as it led them down the dark road for about 100 yards. Then, the dog made a sharp turn onto a long, private driveway. Hulk and the other officers followed the dog up the driveway, which led towards a small house nestled among some trees just off the highway. The dog sniffed all the way up to the garage of the house, and then it stopped. The trail ended right there. Hulk went up to the front door of the house and rang the doorbell. A minute later, a man answered. Despite the late hour, he looked wide awake, and he didn't seem particularly surprised to see a group of police officers on his doorstep. Hulk asked the man for his name and if he had seen or heard anything unusual in the past couple of hours. The man said his name was Nathan Hargett. He told them that about an hour ago, maybe around 3:45 a.m., he'd been woken up by the sound of a strange car loitering near his garage. Nathan said he hadn't recognized the car, but he did notice that it had Texas license plates. He also told them he'd seen a woman with blonde hair in the back seat. Hulk asked Nathan for permission to search his property, and Nathan immediately agreed. Hulk directed the other officers to search inside the house while he went over to the garage. He found a side door on the garage and tried the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open and shined his flashlight inside. But all he saw was a pickup truck and some gardening tools. There was no sign of Kim. By the time the sun started to rise around 6 a.m. that morning, this was officially a missing persons case. Police, with the help of concerned members of the community, began a massive search of the woods and fields surrounding Old Charlotte Highway. Meanwhile, Hulk and Captain Simpson went back to the police station to speak with one of the dispatchers who had been on duty the night before. After interviewing Nathan Hargett and searching his property, they had ruled him out as a suspect. So now, their focus shifted to that mysterious car with Texas plates that Nathan had seen. They were hoping that maybe there had been a report of a traffic stop or a call about a suspicious car in the area, anything at all that might help them figure out who was driving that vehicle. But the dispatcher told them the same thing. It had been a quiet night, no stops, no suspicious vehicle reports. However, she said, there had been one minor incident in the area that night. It was around 2 a.m., which was about an hour before Kim was last heard from. They had gotten a call about a car that had run into a ditch not too far from where Kim's Jeep was ultimately found. Hulk asked which officer had responded to that call. The dispatcher said it was car 491, which was driven by a young rookie officer named Josh Griffin. Hulk immediately got Officer Griffin on the phone. He asked him if he had seen or heard anything unusual while he was out there responding to the car in the ditch. But Griffin said no. He explained that his shift was technically already over when a driver had flagged him down for help. So he had just called for a tow truck, and when it arrived a little after 2:30 a.m., Griffin said he simply went home. Hulk hung up the phone, feeling disappointed. Bridger had said the last time he spoke to Kim was around 3 a.m. If the car in the ditch was already being towed away by 2:30, then it definitely wasn't the same car that Nathan saw outside his garage an hour later. And the driver of that car was likely not involved. Hulk sighed in frustration. But then, another idea occurred to him. He asked Captain Simpson to tell him more about that random run-in he'd had with Kim 2 weeks earlier. It felt like a long shot, but Hulk wondered if maybe the same driver from that road rage incident could have come back, found her again, and maybe chased her off the road. Simpson said he would go dig up the report he had filed on the incident and left to go find it. About half an hour later, Hulk sat at his desk reading through a copy of the police report. It stated that in the very early morning hours of Saturday, March 15th, exactly 2 weeks before Kim's disappearance, Kim had pulled into a convenience store and flagged down Captain Simpson and another officer who was with him, an officer named Roger Griffin. It turned out that Officer Roger Griffin was actually the father of Josh Griffin, the rookie officer who had responded to the car in the ditch. The report went on to say that Simpson and his partner, Roger Griffin, had actually managed to catch up with the car that had been harassing Kim a little further down the road. There were 2 men inside, Eric Williams and George Connell. They claimed that they thought Kim was the one harassing them by flashing her high beams. To Simpson and Griffin at the time, it had all seemed like a big misunderstanding, so they had just let the 2 men go with a warning. But Hulk, looking at this report through a very different lens now, felt that he needed to speak with Eric and George, regardless of what the report said. He found their contact information and called them both. But it turned out both men had rock-solid, airtight alibis for the entire night of Kim's disappearance. Still, something about it bothered Hulk. It struck him as an incredible coincidence that Kim had gone missing from her car on the exact same road at the same time of night and on the same night of the week as the road rage incident just 2 weeks prior. He had a very hard time believing it was all just a coincidence. The next day, just after sunset on Sunday, March 30th, Hulk was driving down Westwood Industrial Drive. It was a deserted, dead-end street at the edge of town, about 2 miles from where Kim's Jeep had been found. As he drove, he saw a couple of police cars parked at the end of the street. He pulled his own car in behind them and got out. He walked into the woods, following the beams of several flashlights that were moving around in the darkness. As he got closer, he saw officers putting up yellow police tape around a small clearing. And then, on the ground in the center of that clearing, he saw a pair of feet in sneakers poking out from underneath a messy pile of roofing shingles and tree branches. The police had gotten a call earlier that evening from 2 men. They were part of the community search effort for Kim, and they had told the dispatcher that they had found a body in the woods at this spot, but that they hadn't touched anything. Now, with Hulk on the scene, the forensics team began to carefully remove the shingles and branches that were covering the body. Hulk pulled out his own flashlight and knelt down to get a better look. He saw immediately that it was a deceased woman, and there was no doubt in his mind that it was Kim Medlin. She was only wearing a pair of shorts, a bra, and a sweatshirt that had been violently pulled up over her head. One side of her face was very badly beaten. There were cuts and bruises all over her neck and scrapes on her knees consistent with a struggle. He noticed that her necklace and her wedding ring were still on. This wasn't a robbery. Hulk stood back as the forensics team worked. They carefully untangled Kim's sweatshirt from around her wrists so they could take clippings of her fingernails just in case she had managed to scratch her killer and leave behind a trace of their DNA. As Hulk watched one of the forensics officers get ready to put the sweatshirt into an evidence bag, he suddenly noticed something and shouted for the officer to stop. Hulk stepped closer and shined his flashlight directly onto the fabric of the sweatshirt. And there, illuminated in the beam of light, was a clear, distinct shoe print. He immediately told the officers to send that sweatshirt directly to the crime lab and see if they could figure out the size and the type of shoe that had left that print. He knew he would have to wait for those results, but he already had a couple of other big clues to help him narrow down a list of suspects. The first was the location of Kim's body. Westwood Industrial Drive was known locally as a lover's lane, a secluded, out-of-the-way spot where people often went to be alone. The fact that Kim's killer had thought to bring her body here meant they were probably a local, someone who knew the area well. It was still theoretically possible that she'd been run off the road by a random stranger, or that a customer had followed her home from work, or even that it was a blue light bandit. But the second big clue pointed away from a stranger. There was no sign of a struggle at Kim's Jeep. Because of that, Hulk didn't think she had been kidnapped by a stranger. He thought it was far more likely that she had willingly gotten out of her car for somebody that she knew and trusted. The very next day, Monday, March 31st, Hulk sat down in an interrogation room across from his friend and his first official murder suspect, Kim's husband, Bridger. From the very beginning, Bridger had been overly involved in the investigation. He had contaminated the crime scene by getting into the Jeep without permission. And now, Hulk had received information that Bridger had lied about his alibi. When Kim first went missing, Bridger had told the police that he got home around 2:30 that morning, called Kim for a brief chat a little before 3, and then immediately went to bed. But now, another police officer had told Hulk that he had personally seen Bridger's black pickup truck driving around the center of town around 2:30 a.m., which was nowhere near Bridger's house and not on the route he would have taken home from his DJ gig. As soon as Hulk sat down, he could see that Bridger was visibly distraught. He had just learned that his wife had been found murdered. But Hulk had a job to do. He cut right to the chase. He told Bridger that another officer had seen his truck in town, that it contradicted his alibi, and he asked him, "Why did you lie?" Immediately, Bridger exploded. He was furious. He shouted at Hulk, saying he couldn't believe that at a time like this, Hulk would accuse him of lying. He was insinuating that he had hurt his own wife. He yelled that he didn't do this. He also shouted at Hulk for wasting precious time looking at him as a suspect when there were so many other clues pointing to a different story. He brought up the lack of a struggle at the Jeep, the rolled-down window, and the missing driver's license, all of which, he argued, made it look like a traffic stop that had gone horribly wrong. Bridger said he knew Kim better than anyone, and she would never, ever get out of her car in the middle of the night for a stranger, especially not after that terrifying road rage incident just 2 weeks earlier. She was on edge. She just wouldn't have done it. When Hulk left the interrogation room a few minutes later, he told his team to track down any and all security footage they could find from around town on the night Kim was killed. They needed to see if there was any proof that Bridger was really driving around when he claimed he was at home. For now, they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and they had to let him go. But Bridger's anger and defensiveness stuck with Hulk. It made him suspicious. And the fact that Bridger had insisted his wife would never have gotten out of her car for a stranger only reinforced Hulk's own theory. She might not have gotten out for a stranger, but she might have gotten out for you, Bridger. Or, Hulk thought, she might have gotten out for the police. Hulk already knew that no official Monroe police officers had pulled anyone over that night, but someone could have been pretending to be a police officer, a blue light bandit. That theory still made a lot of sense. Hulk thought about that bulletin that had gone out over the police radio 2 weeks ago, the one telling officers to be on the lookout for Kim's Jeep. Police radios were not private channels. Anyone with a simple police scanner could have been listening in. And what they would have heard was that a young woman named Kim often drove down this particular road all by herself late at night. They could have been waiting for her, knowing she was a vulnerable target. So Hulk picked up his phone and began calling around to other police departments in the region. He actually found out there had been 2 separate recent reports of blue light bandits harassing women. One of the culprits had already been caught, and he was in jail on the night Kim was killed, so it couldn't have been him. But the other suspect was still at large and had never been found. A couple of days later, on April 4th, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk slammed his phone down in frustration and crossed another name off a list on his notepad. It had been 5 days since Kim's body was found, and all the initial leads he'd had were turning into dead ends. His team had tracked down surveillance footage from the night of Kim's disappearance. There was no sign of Bridger's truck driving through town until well after 4 a.m., after Kim's Jeep had already been found by Captain Simpson. It seemed the officer who claimed to have seen Bridger's truck at 2:30 a.m. had simply been mistaken, just as Bridger had furiously insisted. So Bridger's alibi was solid. Hulk had also reached out to Kim's manager and coworkers at the bar, thinking maybe her killer was a patron who had followed her. But none of them knew of any problems or issues she'd had with any customers. Meanwhile, Hulk's team had located and spoken to a man who worked the night shift at a business near where Kim's Jeep had been found. He said he had left work a little before 3 a.m. on the night Kim disappeared. As he was waiting to turn onto Old Charlotte Highway, he saw her red Jeep drive past. And right behind it, he saw another car that had been going in the opposite direction make a sudden, sharp 3-point turn and speed off after the Jeep. The man said this other car had lights on the roof and reflective tape on the back. He had assumed it was a police car, but he didn't get a good look at the markings. Now, Hulk knew for a fact that every single Monroe police officer who was on duty that night was accounted for, and none of them had pulled anyone over at the time Kim went missing. However, this new witness testimony certainly did support the theory that Kim's killer was posing as a police officer. It supported the blue light bandit theory. So Hulk had spent the last couple of days trying to track down any witnesses who had seen that other blue light bandit, the one who was recently reported in a nearby town but had never been caught. But he kept coming up dry. No one knew anything that could help him track down that suspect. It really seemed like the investigation was grinding to a halt. But then Hulk's phone rang. He answered it. It was an expert from the forensics lab. He had just finished analyzing the shoe print that had been found on Kim's sweatshirt. Hulk leaned forward in his chair, a feeling of nervous anticipation washing over him as the expert told him the results. And when he heard what the expert had to say, Hulk knew exactly how to find Kim's killer. Based on that shoe print, witness testimony, and other forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Kim Medlin on the 29th of March 1997. Around 3 a.m., the killer was driving down Old Charlotte Highway. They had been out prowling for hours, sometimes pulling over young women for minor traffic violations, sometimes for no reason at all, just to exert their authority. And as they drove, they saw a familiar red Jeep pass by. The killer had seen that Jeep driving down this same road several nights a week for the past couple of weeks. They had become obsessed with the young blonde woman who drove it. And tonight, they decided it was finally time to act on that obsession. So they pulled an abrupt, aggressive 3-point turn, raced up behind the Jeep, and flipped on their car's flashing blue and red lights. A moment later, the red Jeep pulled over onto the shoulder as expected. The killer got out of their car and walked up to the driver's side window. The woman inside, Kim, rolled down her window. She handed over her driver's license, and then she politely asked what the problem was. The killer didn't answer her question. Instead, they just told her to get out of the car. Kim was visibly confused, but she was dealing with a police officer, so she did as she was told. The moment she was out of the car, the killer slapped a pair of handcuffs onto her wrists, dragged her over to their patrol car, and shoved her into the back seat. Then, the killer got back in their own driver's seat as Kim started crying in the back, insisting that she hadn't done anything wrong, asking why she was being arrested. But the killer wasn't listening. Their mind was racing. They realized that even though they had been fantasizing about this moment for weeks, they hadn't actually planned what to do next. So, after a moment, they pulled their car over to the side of the road and just idled for a minute trying to figure out their next move. And then, an idea came to them. They put the car in drive and continued down the highway, turning onto a secluded dead-end road. As they drove down this dark road, Kim, in the back seat, suddenly went very quiet. The killer noticed the silence and looked in the rearview mirror. They saw her moving around, fiddling with something behind her back. And then the killer realized, with a jolt of panic, that in all their excitement, they had forgotten to engage the child's safety locks on the rear doors. The killer immediately reached for the power lock button on their own door, but it was too late. The rear door flew open, and Kim jumped out of the moving car. The killer slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a hard stop. They leaped out and ran back towards Kim, who was lying in the middle of the road, her hands still cuffed behind her back. Without even thinking, the killer raised their heavy-duty flashlight and smashed it into the side of Kim's head. Then they stomped on her back, breaking her neck. But the killer wasn't done. They knelt down, put the long metal flashlight against Kim's throat, and then pulled back on both ends, creating a makeshift garrote. They pulled as hard as they could, until Kim stopped moving. After she was dead, they dragged her body off the road and deep into the woods. There, they removed the handcuffs and hastily covered her body with loose branches and debris they found nearby. Then, the killer went home and meticulously cleaned their car, making sure there was no evidence that would tie them to the murder. But they didn't realize they had left behind one crucial, damning piece of evidence at the scene, that shoe print on Kim's sweatshirt. The print had a very distinct V-shaped pattern on its tread, which made it very easy for forensics to identify. Weeks later, the crime lab traced that print back to a specific shoe made by the Thorogood Company, a well-known supplier of military and uniform footwear. And that particular model of shoe happened to be the exact same one that was issued to every officer in the Monroe Public Safety Department. Kim's killer was not just posing as a police officer. They were a real police officer. The killer was Officer Josh Griffin, the off-duty rookie cop who claimed he had simply responded to a car in a ditch and then gone home a half an hour before Kim went missing. It would later turn out that Josh had learned all the details about Kim's vehicle and her late-night driving patterns from his own father, Officer Roger Griffin. After his father and Captain Simpson had responded to Kim's road rage complaint on March 15th, Roger had casually told his son about the incident. And from that moment, Josh had become obsessed. He had been on the lookout for Kim's Jeep ever since, just waiting for his chance. Josh Griffin was arrested on the 30th of May, 1997, about 2 months after Kim's murder. He was eventually convicted of first-degree kidnapping and first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. As for his motive, the prosecution argued that he had become fixated on Kim after hearing about her from his father and, in an act of horrific violence, decided to abduct and kill her. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.